And in this context, I'm also especially glad that we have Professor Marcus Wolf joining us from the Department of Music. It's apt that we have a specialist, we have a professor in music joining us when we talk of Rabindranath Tagore. Thank you for joining us. And finally, I'd like to greet Professor Amrit Sen from the Vishwa Bharati University of Shantiniketan. I think it's an institution which really embodies what he stood for, where the mind is open and where the head is held high without fear, and where all the walls are broken down and freedom of thought is given, really. I think that is what that institution stands for, and I'm glad that we have you joining us today, Professor. You know, Rabindranath Tagore was the first Asian to receive a Nobel Prize in 1913, and it was for literature, but he was the first Asian. And between this Nobel Prize in 1913 and 41, he was perhaps the most famous poet in the world. Not only was he a widely appreciated novelist, poet, short story writer, but he was also respected in the subcontinent as a political and social reformer, as a musician, as a composer, painter, environmentalist, and importantly, educator. And in a nutshell, it is his work aimed at promoting long-term multicultural, spiritual, and social understanding, I think, which remains his great legacy. Today, when we look at his contribution, many people wonder whether his life and work is as relevant today as it was when he was alive. And my answer to that is, of course, yes. He is the greatest poet, writer, and music composer in Bangla. And for those who are not aware, it's a language which is spoken by more than 200 million Bengalis, if I may say so. And it is a population which is larger than that of Brazil. So you can understand the impact that he has had on a society as large as the Brazilian society. And even today, he continues to influence the thoughts significantly. And as I mentioned earlier, in a world which is increasingly challenged by narrow-minded ethnic nationalisms, it is his writings which offer a clear and a strong voice of reason and humanitarianism. Concerned about individuals and societies losing their moral compass, Tagore consistently spoke against all forms of xenophobia, assertions of ethnic superiority, or chest-thumping nationalism. Indeed, he had his own differences with other prominent leaders of the independence movement, such as Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. And he felt, and he was not afraid to uphold his convictions and promote the need for treating all equally. Tagore also had a special place for Latin America in his heart. I'm not going to be talking of Argentina much. I mean, all of us are aware of his special affection for Argentina. Shortly after winning the Nobel Prize, his poems were translated into Spanish. He did make a short visit to Argentina in 24 and 25. And 1924, what is interesting is that Pablo Neruda paraphrased a poem from Tagore in The Gardener in his 20 love poems and A Song of Despair. This book sold more than 1 million copies, and Pablo Neruda himself went on to win a Nobel Prize a century later. When we come to Brazil, Tagore again has a very special connection through Gilberto Freire. I think my understanding that Gilberto Freire's trilogy of making of modern Brazil has created a new identity for Brazil, for the Brazilians. It has changed the Brazilians' perceptions of itself. It has made it more comfortable with its own identity, and it has helped to create what is Brazil today as a society. And Freire was also charmed by ideas of Tagore. He had met him in the university in the US. And 10 years after that meeting, Freire wrote in his memoir, he reflected on his poetry in a short essay, stating Tagore, a Brazilian view of his lyrical poetry. The challenge today is whether a poet as complex as Tagore can ever be reduced to a simple set of religious or moral or social ideals. And it is a challenge which even the famous British poet Yeats faced without finding an answer. He was not able to fix Tagore, he was not able to give an identity to Tagore, so to say, or he was not able to paraphrase as to what Tagore actually stood for. Such was the complexity of Tagore's approach. And it may not be wrong to say that the the dramatic energy which drove Tagore's creativity may not have been actually successfully communicated even during his own lifetime. In conclusion, for Tagore, it was of the highest importance, as I mentioned, of people to be able to live and reason in freedom. His attitudes towards politics and culture, nationalism, tradition and modernity, all can be seen in the light of that belief. And perhaps nothing expresses it better as clearly as a poem in the Gitanjali, which I mentioned earlier, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habits. Into that heaven of freedom, my father, let my country awake. And for my Brazilian friends, I would like to say that this is a poem which we are taught in our childhood, in our schools, and which we remember and we recall, and which we believe sets the tone for where we are trying to achieve in our post 75 years of independence. Thank you. Thank you again for this invitation to this event, and I look forward to listening to you, to the distinguished panelists.
Many thanks, Ambassador. So I will invite now Professor Adrian.
Bom dia a todos, senhor embaixador da Índia, senhor cônsul-geral da Índia, senhora diretora do Centro Cultural Swami Vivekananda de São Paulo, os caros colegas Antônio Menezes, vice-chefe do Departamento de Letras Orientais, Laura Izarra, que também hoje representando a UCANI, em nome da Faculdade de Filosofia, Letras e Ciências Humanas e do Departamento de Letras Modernas, quero dar muito boas-vindas a todos que são convidados, né? Também, obviamente, aos professores convidados que hoje vão nos honrar com a sua palavra, a todos os colegas presentes. E bom, dizer que a realização de um evento como este é uma alegria para a faculdade e para o departamento, apesar da situação tão difícil em que ele é realizado. E é um tipo de evento que reafirma não apenas os vínculos de cooperação com a Índia, com a produção universitária e cultural indiana, mas também uma vocação e uma perspectiva universalizante por parte da faculdade e do departamento, né? Muitas vezes, quando pensamos num departamento de letras modernas, talvez pelo modo como foram se constituindo os saberes e os espaços institucionais nas universidades, imaginamos que o departamento que estuda a França, a Alemanha, a Itália, a Inglaterra, a Espanha, como muitos Estados Unidos, e nosso departamento e nossas áreas de conhecimento, e aqui estou me referindo muito especialmente à de língua inglesa, sempre trabalharam com uma perspectiva decolonial, não eurocêntrica, em que, digamos, nos interessa tudo aquilo que tem a ver no mundo inteiro com as línguas com que trabalhamos e com os contatos e os contextos de plurilinguismo em que essas línguas se inserem, né? Eu penso que na introdução que fez o senhor embaixador acerca de Tagore, fica também muito claro um percurso de um intelectual por espaços plurilingües e muito diversos dentro do mundo, e não tenho nada para acrescentar nesse sentido, mas que desejar a todos um ótimo evento, né? E mais uma vez as boas-vindas.
Muito obrigada. Adriana, Pooja, please, the floor is yours then.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Professor Adrian and Honorable Ambassador, Mr. Reddy. I guess it's time that we start with our speakers. Our first speaker for today is a special guest from India, joining from Calcutta, Shantiniketan. So just to give you a brief about Professor Amrit Sen. Professor Sen is presently the professor and former head of the Department of English at Vishwa Bharati, Shantiniketan. He has a keen interest in 18th century studies, travel writings, Tagore studies, and the history of science. Some of his major publications and edited volumes include Gitanjali, the centenary edition, 2012, Rabindranath Tagore, the unsung hero, Vishwa Bharati, 2013, Rabindranath Tagore and his circle in 2015, Sharing the Dream, the remarkable women of Shantiniketan, 2016, Confluence of Mind, the Rabindranath Tagore and Patrick Geddes reader on education and environment, which was co-edited by Tapati Mukhopadhyay and Babashi Fraser in 2017. I guess the list is really long. Professor Amrit Sen has done some commendable work, and he has edited, co-edited, and written loads and loads of books. He is the joint coordinator of UGC UKRE project in the Scotland-India Continuum and Tagore and his circle, and the deputy coordinator of UGC SAP project on Rabindranath Tagore, the East-West Confluence at the Department of English. Apart from his academic engagements, he has also translated and performed in Tagore's dance dramas at national and international programs. Among his major awards, he has won the Outstanding Thesis Award by the Government of India in 2017, the Research Award by the UGC, the Oxford 18th Century Bursary, and a host of academic recognitions. Professor Amrit Sen is also presently officiating as the director of Granthana Vibhag, the publication division of the Vishwa Bharati. Today he will be highlighting on the making of a poet, Tagore and world literature. It is an honor for us to have Professor Amrit Sen today with us, and I'm sure that all of us are really going to get a different perspective about Rabindranath Tagore and his contribution to world literature. Welcome, Professor Amrit Sen. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Pooja, and a very good morning to all of you in Brazil, and good evening to all of you who are listening in India. I pay my sincere regards to Ambassador Mr. Suresh Reddy for his very succinct and very penetrating comments on Rabindranath Tagore. Professor Izara, I also acknowledge the presence of Professor Laundo and Professor Wolf, both of whom I see have a shared interest in Shantiniketan, so that makes this even more interesting. And it's also very unique, that we are operating in two different time zones, which I think Tagore would have very greatly enjoyed, given the fact that he saw this entire world as linked by threads of human association. I'd also like to just briefly remind you that Tagore was alive when and creative when the Spanish flu struck the world, and has two incredible works which talk about disease and convalescence. Anyways, that's not what I would like to sort of present today, but I'd like to bring forward to you, or before you rather, a small presentation that I've made about a point that Mr. Reddy made about the incredible diversity within Rabindranath Tagore's creative horizon. Here's a small presentation that I have, which will also give you a few sort of glimpses of the conditions in which he worked and the various activities that Tagore had apart from being only a poet. So here's my screen presented before you. It's taking just a wee little bit of time. Is it visible now?
Yes.
Yeah, it is.
Yes.
Right. Thank you. So the question that I'm asking here, and the title of the presentation is, what went into the making of this extraordinary man? And what did he have to talk about, or what did he have to say about world literature? The operative word that Tagore uses, this is something which comes in almost all his ideas, is the term Vishwa, or the world itself. So, what is the philosophy that goes into his making? What is his view on the literatures of the world? What were the world literatures that were to influence him? Now, here's a painting, here's a picture, I'm sorry, taken in 1932 when Tagore visited Iran, what was then Persia. And he went, as he would always go, to the tomb and the memorials of poets. It's very interesting, Tagore, wherever he traveled, and you'll have to remember that traveling from India at that point of time was not an easy affair. Tagore traveled to meet poets, to the memorials of poets, and always planted a tree. Now that's one of the things I find fascinating in the way in which the environment and its concerns, along with literature and culture, sort of was transmitted and shared by Tagore across the globe. Now, this is when he visited the tomb of the renowned Persian poet Hafiz. And sitting by the side of the tomb, he said, and this is the travelogue that was published in 1932, I was filled, he said, with wonder. I felt we were two friends of one tavern. After thousands of years, beyond the barriers of life and death, a traveler had arrived who was a friend to Hafiz forever. Mr. Reddy just mentioned, the poem that was sort of taken by Pablo Neruda and recreated in his own way. And Tagore would have really enjoyed that because he suggested that the world of poets was a continuous give and take, as was the world of global human beings. Now, he also suggested, of course, that the path of all poets across all ages is my path. And the religion that he talked about throughout his writings is that of a poet's unique perspective of the poet's religion. Now, my questions, and I'm sort of limiting myself to these questions here. What were the salient aspects of literature, given that we know Tagore mostly as a litterateur? What were his persuasive ideas of world consciousness? This he called Vishwa Bodh. Vishwa, the world, Bodh, the consciousness. And how does this idea percolate into the concept of Vishwa Sahitya, or world literature? And given that he saw literature as belonging to the world, what went into the making of his creative horizon? And the final question that I'm going to ask here is, how did this go into pedagogy? Because as both Professor Rizara and Mr. Reddy pointed out, Tagore was not just a poet, he was also the builder of one of India's most hallowed institutions, Vishwabharati. And how did it prove to be different? Now, if you look at the Tagore household, we'll find that at the end of the 19th century, this was one of the first really multicultural spaces within Calcutta and India, when you had the classical Indian Brahmin sort of experience, you had Christian influences percolating through the Brahmo religion of Raja Ram Mohan Roy. You had a very strong influence of the Islamic religion on Tagore's father, Debendranath, the Upanishads, of course, and the monotheistic Christian beliefs. Now, Tagore was schooled in these literatures, as it were. He would be reading Vaishnava poetry of love. He would be reading the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, of course. He would also be reading Shakespeare and translating Shakespeare at the age of 12. He would be listening to the poetry of Rumi and Hafiz from his father. Apart from this, he was also, initiated into a lot of literatures within India, as it were, from within India. Today morning, we were discussing how Tagore traveled to Punjab with his father. and sort of picked up a lot of Punjabi bhajans, which he later on transcreated into his Bangla songs. And of course, there was an important travel to the southern part of India, from where a large number of songs and tunes worked its way into Rabindranath's music. So here was a man who was being sort of exposed to this multicultural melange that was India and the globe at that point of time. But between 1890 and 1900, Tagore had to take up his estate, his father's estate, and he traveled crisscrossed across riverine Bengal. And I have here a picture of Tagore on the boat across the river Padma. Now, this was a life-altering experience for him, because from the confines of the city in Calcutta, Tagore got to know Bengal and rural India. Now, this, I think, was so important because he realized the problems of the people, the disconnect between what was the intelligentsia and the common man. And he realized that there were many Indias, and that until and unless these Indias could be bridged, nationalism or any great militant movement for nationalism would really have no effect on the lives of the people. Now, 1912 onwards, of course, as Mr. Reddy mentioned, Tagore traveled globally, earning the Nobel Prize, winning the Nobel Prize, and then across different continents. Latin America was, of course, one of his destinations, where his story with Ocampo was greatly well known. You had also the influence of Freire and the Brazilian connection, which also was articulated by Mr. Reddy. So it's interesting in the ways in which, Yeats, André Gide, in Germany, he was rapidly translated and thereby influenced world literature himself. In fact, one of the texts that I'm right now reading is when, Tagore's text traveled to the Baltics, and which were now at that point of time faced with the Nazi oppression, and his play Dagkor, or the Post Office, was translated and performed in one of these concentration camps in Warsaw. So it's fabulous, and it's very interesting in the way literature and his ideas dispersed across the globe. Now, the philosophy. Now, this was what Tagore meant by Vishwabodh. He realized that, man does not exist in a prison house by himself, and it is his kinship with the world that his fullest significance is in. Now, this came in from the Upanishadic idea, radiated, I'm sorry, please excuse me, radiated across through the ideas of the Brahmo philosophy, especially Raja Rammohn Roy, India's first major, what we'll call intercultural ambassador, as it were, of that point of time. And then through his literature, Tagore wanted to find this bond and this mystery of unity. So how does a very tiny individual self find its relationship with the world? This was the operative idea within his literature. The concept of a small I, the Choto Ami in Bangla, smaller version of the self, with the larger version of the world in general. And he uses three very important Indian words. One, which he calls Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram, the truth. The other is the very concept of Anandam, or joy. And the other is Leela, or play. So this, triad of Satyam, Anandam, and Leela went into this search for this bridge between the individual self and the world at large. When he met Einstein, they had a very interesting debate as to whether, truth exists independent of man. Einstein, being the scientist, suggested yes, it does. Tagore suggested that whatever is true is only a human truth. Now, this question about Sahitya or literature, I just break this term Sahitya into two sections. Sahit, or together, what is for the welfare of everybody. Now, therefore, Tagore suggested that literature has this bond of equivalence. And all across the globe, all literature and art, expression, he said, is part of the surplus of humanity. And Tagore has this fabulous essay called The Angel of Surplus, where he suggests that what is the surplus in man, and he was not talking about the economic surplus, of course, is the one which seeks to reach out to the broader universe. And therefore, that is what bridges the smaller self and the larger self. So Tagore's poetry is marked by this continuous dialectic between the finite and the infinite, the human and the divine. And you have, of course, this concept of Ananda, Amritam, and Leela. Now, Tagore sort of develops this idea of the surplus and suggests that within this surplus do we carry our personality. And within the surplus, man's philosophy and science thrive. When he talks about world literature, and Tagore does not use the term comparative literature, he uses the term world literature, reminding us, of course, of Goethe's similar concept. He uses a very interesting metaphor. He says world literature is like a temple. And that is a temple which is built by the master mason. And every poet, as it were, brings in his or her salient intervention in the form of a brick. And therefore, this sort of majestic structure sort of keeps on growing. It is never complete. And that it can only survive because everybody brings something to it. And it is here he suggests that there is this movement beyond the self into the non-self, beyond the finite into the infinite. And it is this that creates the bond between literateurs of all ages. Now, for English students, of course, there is this term which was coined by Harold Bloom, the anxiety of influence. And Bloom suggests that it is only hard poets or hard literateurs who can cross this anxiety of influence and internalize and create a form out of whatever already exists. And therefore, Rabindranath's idea is one also of borrowing and translation. Now, the Indian word that he uses is, of course, tarjuma, which would be transcreation. And he suggests that there's no shame in the exchange of ideas and literatures, and that from the other influences, or from the manifold influences, does the consciousness of a poet develop. And he acknowledges that his own personality, as well as Indian literature, has largely evolved from this interface between India and the globe. Now, Tagore, I will speak about a few influences only because of the limitations of time. But the one influence that comes through in Tagore's poetry especially is the Vaishnava influence and the Bhakti cult, where there is the seamless merging of the self and the non-self, the finite and the infinite. And very interestingly, in the poems of the Gitanjali, if you look at it, is this interplay of the I and the you. Tagore, of course, uses a more majestic thou in English. But as the Bengali poet who recently passed away, Shankar Ghosh, suggested, that it is in this, dialectical interplay that the god of Tagore becomes a human and the poet himself becomes divinely interplayed within the Leela. And very importantly, there is this interplay between the literary and the musical. As Ms. Reddy was pointing out, most of Tagore's songs are also poems. So poetry that is to be sung in the way that the Bhakti cult did. I have provided two small samples here. One is from Chondridase, the noted Vaishnava poet, and the other is from Tagore. And this is an incredibly brilliant poem that I like personally, and where he talks about the hidden honey of this lotus that expands on the ocean of the light. And in this playhouse of infinite forms, I have had my play, and here have I caught sight of him who is formless. So you see, this form and formlessness, finite and the infinite, the individual I and the greater truth, is in continuous tension and play within Tagore. Now, at this point of time also, Tagore comes in contact with a wandering minstrel group of Bengal who are called the Bowls, and I am very glad that Professor Wolf is here, who has worked on the Bowls, and I'm sure will be bringing them in his presentation as well. But the Bowls become important because, like the Sufis, they're free from any dogmatic religion and from any straight-jacketed format of poetry and music. So their form is a free-flowing form once again, and rooted very much within the earth of the country. And therefore Tagore draws upon this idea of artistic creative freedom and the idea of the infinite, not as something abstract, but as an everyday phenomenon, the bond that can be vaguely realized, but that can never be defined. So this, he suggests, can provide a gateway through which, you see, literature does not become the purview of a certain class, but it can radiate across into the masses in general. Now, at the same time, we must also acknowledge the presence of the Romantics, especially the Western writings. Of course, Tagore was greatly influenced by Dante, but I'll leave that for the moment and talk about two Romantic poets who influenced him greatly. One being Shelley. Tagore was a public intellectual who, relentlessly wrote against oppression. Now, he did not merely write about the British. He wrote about, of course, we all know that he renounced his knighthood against the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, writing a letter to Lord Chelmsford. But he equally wrote, as Mr. Reddy once again pointed out, I refer to his very short but succinct speech. He also, when Gandhiji wrote that the Bihar earthquake was a result of, untouchability, Tagore protested and suggested that, rationality had to intervene into natural phenomenon, and that irrational statements could lead to false belief within the masses. So here were two of India's greatest personalities engaged in a continuous public debate. But the idea, I think, in my personal opinion, the poet who influenced Rabindranath most was probably William Wordsworth. Now, for Wordsworth, as we teach in our English honors courses, nature was a source of delight, a source of refuge, and a way of a greater understanding into the still sad music of humanity, as Wordsworth writes in Tintern Abbey. But for Tagore, nature was more than that. Nature was king. Nature was a source of infinite delight, and nature had to be made as part and parcel of human existence itself. Now, when we talk today about the Anthropocene, and we talk about the ways in which major dams are damaging countries, Rabindranath was the first to talk about ecological balances, the way in which technology had to be harnessed and the displaced had to be acknowledged in places like Muktadhara. And what is unique in Tagore, and this is what brings me to Vishwabharati later on, is the way in which this consciousness about nature was not just a poetic consciousness, but he also wanted to impart it into pedagogy among his younger students. Now, how did he do this? And let me show you two very rare pictures of the Britkoropon, where it's a tree plantation festival, as you can see, taking place in his university among young students, where the tree is, as it were, treated as a sacrosanct deity and a part and parcel of human existence. So the tree does not become just an object, but also part of his king, part and parcel of Vishwabharati, as it were. And you can now understand why Tagore planted trees wherever he went. And he also saw to it that the flora and the fauna of the local atmospheres would be sort of imparted into the curriculum so that his students would joyously celebrate the varieties of nature and acknowledge it among their midst. This is a picture of one of India's greatest festivals, Bashantotsav, which is equivalent of the Holi. But what Tagore did was he curbed the excesses of Holi and made it aesthetic and brought nature rather than just color, but the flora and the fauna as part and parcel of the pedagogic curriculum. Now, the two other very interesting influences, of one I have already mentioned, Hafiz, and the other Rumi, about this concept of human love as transcending across all boundaries. And Tagore, and that's a very beautiful poem by Rumi, which is one of my favorites. Ours is not a caravan of despair. And you can see how Rabindranath talks about the divine, as it were, continuously filling up his own his own self and filling it with fresh life, and how he becomes a kind of a little flute of a reed thou hast carried over hills and dales, and the infinite gifts that come to me only on these very small hands of mine. So in Tagore, within the divine, the individual is not lost. It creates this kind of a bridge. Towards the latter half of his career, Tagore was also writing a series of smaller poems. And one of his major visits was in 1916 to Japan, where he picked up the form of the haiku. And we can see in poems like Lekhon, which I've sort of given there in the presentation, the way in which he tries to sort of experiment with pithy, precise, small ideas. And once again, you see the spirit of exchange that Tagore talked about, manifested in that my very inadequate translation of a haiku that he wrote in Bengali. The saint in saffron once taught your nation. He's talking about the movement of Buddhism. And today he goes to your door as a disciple to learn a different education in modernity. So, cyclical histories, continuous influxes. And, but I have an idea that Tagore really moved away from the Japanese haiku because of its metrical restrictions. Now, finally, this brings me to how this idea about world consciousness, world literatures and cultures could be brought into a system of pedagogy. And what did the university mean for Rabindranath? Now, in 2021, when the two universities are interacting here, the University of Sao Paulo and Vishwabharati, and but today we take globalization as something which is taken for granted, really. You have to understand that in 1921, almost exactly 100 years ago, Shantiniketan was a small rural hamlet where to reach the next railway station, you had to travel kilometers on a bullock cart. From that corner of India, Tagore dreamed to transform it into a zone where ideas and cultures, religions and literatures could come and interact. And that is where this is the statement of the ideals of Vishwabharati, to study the mind of man in its realization of different aspects of truth. That's the Satyam. Intimate relation to patient study and research the different cultures of the East to approach the West, realize that a common fellowship, this meeting, and a center of culture where religion, literature, history, science, and art of all the religions could be brought together in the name of one supreme being who is Shantam, Sivam, Advaitam, present in everything. And I would like to really conclude my presentation, I've already taken up a lot of time, with an image of this poet, institution builder, pedagogic thinker, teaching his students at Shantiniketan. Classes would be organized under the trees, where nature would be part and parcel of the education itself, where the mind would be free, and where Tagore would impart lessons not about parochialism and building up walls of nationalism, but rather freeing them and creating human beings who would not only be Indians or Bengalis, but world citizens. So the making of the poet, and I suggest it's very important for us to understand what went into his making to realize what were the ideas that he was circulating. And this complex process of assimilation and the esemplastic imagination, his belief in a global community of literature that was not bounded by time, space, or class, in sync with his idea of Vishwabodh or world consciousness, and a complex poetics, and this is where I find Tagore so fascinating, that traverses across forms and radiates into the idea of pedagogy. So, you see, philosophy, literature, art practices, festivals, all merge finally into what it suggested was the cargo of his life's greatest treasure, the university space. And I'm very, very sort of honored and humbled that through Tagore, today, these university spaces, and in reality, the entire world, as it were connected through the World Wide Web, can be together with us as we celebrate this visionary. I thank you for providing me with this opportunity and extend my heartiest greetings to everybody in Brazil. And we hope that soon, we can extend the arm of welcome for you to visit this lovely small university of ours in Shantiniketan. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Sen. I think that was a wonderful presentation, and it really took us through, various facets of what Rabindranath Tagore has done, and how he's really influenced, the world culture actually, across. And as you said, I think, this is really the beginning of your relationship, with the universities here in Brazil. This is just the first event, and I'm sure there are many, many, many more to come. And we hope that we're able to organize more such things, and we're able to invite you. And yes, Vishwabharati, though, is a small university, as you said, but I think, what it offers is something remarkable, and people really look up to, going to, I think it's a dream for everyone to really visit Vishwabharati, once in their lifetime, actually. So I think that's a tip for all our Brazilian students, So if you're visiting India, I think Vishwabharati is the place that you should really be to. Okay, I'm sure, our viewers, our students have lots of questions, but we will be, I think we're running short of time. So at the end of, once all the speakers have presented, I think we'll be taking a few questions at the end if we have time, or else we will be sending the questions, to the professor, and he may answer them, and we can then share the the answers with the students. But let's go ahead with our next speaker now. I now invite Professor Laura to kindly take this forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Amrit Sen, for your presentation. It's fantastic, and to thank you to the ambassador that has done that introduction to situate us for your own lecture. And of course, we will have this link going on further in the future. Now.